The movie is sort of asking the question, is he really the Messiah, or is he a political construct? Is their religion real, or is the whole thing the cynical construct of the Bene Gesserit? And meanwhile, we've got the Harkonnens doing really bad things to everybody.
So what exactly is going on in Dune Parts 1 and 2?
Oof.
There's a lot.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
So this is one of those stories that it's hard to film, right? I mean, because there's a lot going on.
Well, and often they actually said that it was
impossible.
Impossible to film.
Right.
And the 1984 version of
Proves
Dune
it.
actually proved it.
You mustn't speak!
Yeah, and actually the miniseries version that was on Sci-Fi and the earliest,
Which I didn't think was that bad.
anyway, it was lame. It didn't work. So this is based on Frank Herbert's 1965 novel. Man, I don't know what was going on when Herbert and Tolkien and these guys were they were creating these genre-defining epics.
And these huge worlds,
And
huge,
massive,
complicated worlds.
Massive worlds. And so Tolkien, and maybe we'll talk about Tolkien at some point
Down
in the
the road.
future, he created a fantasy world. A lot of people feel like these sort of go hand in hand, as this is the fantasy really template, and Dune is a sci-fi template that, I don't know, maybe some of Isaac Asimov's stuff is as broad as what Herbert tried to do, but I read it in high school, and I remember, and I read...
Did you like it in high school?
I did.
See, I read it in junior high.
Loved it.
And I hated it.
Yeah, well,
But that's just
that's par for
Go
the
ahead.
course. I
Yeah.
mean, someday we'll talk about The Last Jedi too, and I'll tell you why Paul is wrong.
It's a great movie.
But I
Go ahead.
digress.
Go ahead.
So, what I loved about it, and what I think that Herbert does, and what the movies have done with varying degrees of success, is it is world building on a total level. We have politics, we have religion, we have commerce and economy, we have really different people groups, we have ethnic conflicts, we have, you name it, if there's an experience in the real world, it's probably in here, you know? I mean, it felt, especially Denis Villeneuve's version, remarkably, I think, relevant to our world today. And I think it speaks to a story's power that even something that was written 60 years ago remains that kind of relevant today. And I will just say, and we're taking the deep dive into nerddom right here, Denis Villeneuve, who's a French-Canadian director, he did, what, Blade Runner 2049?
Arrival, he's done a ton of stuff.
Big stuff.
Interesting stuff.
Interesting stuff. He said he has been storyboarding Dune in his mind since he was 13.
Oh my goodness.
So he is a Dune
fanatic.
And I'm guessing it's going to get a Best Cinematography nomination. Like the scene where they're climbing up the cliff and the sun is backlighting them. I mean, if you didn't see this on the big screen, well, I feel sorry for you, because that's the way it was intended to be seen. So should I talk about the basic overarching story?
Yeah, do talk about
Or would you
that.
like to?
No, you know what? I'm going to talk about the basic overarching
that.
story, and then you can interrupt me
'Cause I
when
will-
I go wrong.
Yeah, and you will.
Okay, so
wait.
essentially we have...
No. Okay.
All right, first.
I won't do that again for a while.
That was pretty funny. All right, so let's actually let's unpack what we're trying to do here, just in case this is the first episode that you've ever watched of this particular weird series that
Our
we're
little
doing.
madness that we do together.
Exactly. These are movies that don't necessarily fit the family-friendly profile that Plugged In usually embraces, right?
Right.
These are more difficult movies, probably movies more for adults. They have some content, so be sure to read the Plugged In reviews of everything we talk about here. And by the way, we're going to be talking about spoilers as well. So,
Right.
so be careful.
Dune
of
is
all of
about a
those.
planet full of sand. Shocker. Also, there are giant worms. Paul, what's happening in Dune?
Okay, so essentially the political component.
was a worm.
Yeah, I could tell. Such a good worm. Essentially, we have two big houses. The galaxy is ruled by essentially the Emperor and a bunch of very powerful houses. One of those houses is House Atreides. Atreides, thank you.
It's hard to say.
And then you've got House Harkonnen.
Right.
The Atreides.
They call it Harkonnen in the movie, but that's
Harkonnen?
wrong. It's Harkonnen.
Yeah, because you can read that in the Herbert books. You know the pronunciation.
Right.
So, House, say it again.
Harkonnen?
No,
Atreides.
Atreides. They're the good guys. So you
Sort
have...
of.
Sort
Which is part of the issue with Dune, but we'll come back to that.
Oh, that's interesting. So House Atreides, they're the sort of good guys. We have Duke Leto, who rules this house. They have just been sent to this planet called Arrakis by the Emperor to take over this big old sandy planet. It has
Why
no
would
water.
anybody want that?
Why would anybody want that? And I will tell you why. Because there is such a thing called spice there.
Yes.
It is apparently, this whole book and movie is based on drugs. It is a hallucinogen.
It's written in 1965.
Yeah, exactly. So you know that it's got to have drugs. Anyway, it's this hallucinogen that makes space travel essentially possible.
Yep.
The space
Navigators, the Guild,
Thank you.
Spacing
The
Guild.
Yes, the Spacing Guild. They need spice to be able to navigate safely through all the galaxy as we know it.
Right.
But it also
Instead
works.
of an R2 unit, they take drugs. Right?
Already, this whole
I mean, drugs or a small, lovable robot. Which would you pick? Well, Frank Herbert picked drugs.
How did this ever become such a big deal? Anyway, so this is what Arrakis has. Atreides is the Atreides.
Atreides.
They're coming.
I wasn't going to correct you, but you caught it yourself.
They are taking over the planet at the request of the Emperor from House Harkonnen, which has ruled it for 80 years.
Right.
And House Harkonnen is filled with terrible, terrible people.
I mean,
they are like the orcs in Lord of the Rings.
No, I was
right?
You've never met Harkonnens before. I have. They're not human. They're brutal.
going to say Baron Harkonnen makes Darth Vader look like Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, he is a bad,
He's a bad
dude.
man, and he floats. And
And he
it's kind of weird.
floats. Yeah, that's
Because he's too fat to walk.
He's too fat to walk. So that's essentially what we have here. But here's the thing. Here is the thing.
Dear listener.
Dear
viewer.
listener. So the Emperor does not actually like, well, he likes House Atreides just fine, but he knows
He
that
has
the house
secret, deeper plots.
he has secret, deeper.
I'm sorry. See, it's happening. I can't just let you tell the story.
It's all right. It's all right. I'm so used to it now.
Right.
So, but you have this complicated political machinization. Would that be-
Machination.
Thank you. And essentially, there's going to be this whole plot to get House Atreides off of the planet and maybe out of the entire galaxy.
Right,
forever.
because in the words of Admiral Akbar,
It's
a trap.
It's a trap.
So House Atreides ends up on Arrakis. It is a setup. Baron Harkonnen and his forces invade, which the Emperor... Exactly. The Emperor knew was going to happen. They attempt to wipe out House Atreides,
Yeah.
but it doesn't happen. And
It
Paul,
doesn't.
who is the heir to the house and
Heir to the house.
a young man, and it gets better.
It does get better.
Go ahead. No, to you.
Okay. Yeah, so he is heir to House Atreides, and he is also part of this weird cult of the Bene Gesserit.
Yes.
His mom belongs to this Bene Gesserit cult, religion, faction thing that sort of has these weird undertones. It essentially sort of pseudo-controls the entire galaxy in their own
Yes.
sneaky way.
Yeah.
The Bene Gesserit, they're all women or have been up to this point. They have these magical powers. They're able to use
they're called
the
witches.
voice. Yes. They use the Batman voice. We just talked about the Dark Knight.
Darkness.
Yeah. So that's the voice that they use to control people around. Drop the knife.
Drop
You know,
the knife.
so-
I'm going to drop the knife.
Give me the knife.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
So they have these secret powers.
Yeah.
All of the Bene Gesserit for all of history have been these women.
Right.
But
There's a
Jessica,
prophecy.
there is a prophecy that there's this. Well, you tell about the prophecy.
Well, there's a prophecy that there will be born a man
Yes.
who has all of their powers, all of their memories, the Kwisatz Haderach.
Oh, very good.
And that he has multiple titles, like just keeping track of the foreign names and titles in Dune. If you haven't read the book, the movie's hard, frankly, because you'd be like, wait, what just happened?
Yeah. I'm letting you pronounce everything.
Muad'dib Atreides!
From here on out.
Jessica is
I can pronounce Jessica.
Leto Atreides' concubine. She's not a wife.
Correct.
And she decides that she wants to take a shot at giving birth to the Kwisatz Haderach, but it's
Because
not.
that's what they can do. They
Right.
can actually choose their gender.
Let me
I
say
guess.
that one of the things that's happening in the entire story is that Frank Herbert is arguably deconstructing the role of religion in relationship to politics. And the Bene Gesserit, even though they're all women, it sort of feels vaguely medievally Catholic. And they're sort of the power behind the throne. They do have special powers, but with a lot of them, you're not even sure if they believe in their own religion or if they're all just drunk on power and want to hang on to it. So in some ways, it's a pretty deeply cynical look at the relationship between religion, organized religion, and political power.
And the other thing that they do is they actually go to these civilizations, these planets, and they plant little hints of these messianic figures that may
Right.
come to that planet, depending on how their own mechanizations go.
Yep.
Machinations. Thank you.
Yeah, and so they've done that here, and there's a group of desert people, which, frankly, seem visually evocative, I think, of a lot of what we would see in the Middle East. I mean, they wear a Middle Eastern style garb, except Arrakis is so harsh, they wear these suits called still suits.
Recycle all the
so
water.
they can recycle all of their bodily fluids because there's no water in, yeah, exactly. I'm not trying to be crude. That's what the still suits do.
It's just amazing how complicated this story is.
It's a crazy
and how
story.
big these movies have
Yeah.
been in spite of it, right?
Yep. They're called the Fremen, and they're led by a guy named Stilgar, and they
At
are
least one group, right?
At least one group, but he kind of becomes, he's a one tribe leader.
Yeah.
There's a belief that the Lisan al-Gaib will come, their messianic leader, and I'm going to cut to the chase here. It looks like Paul Atreides, who takes on the name Muad'dib, looks like he could be this Messiah. And the movie is sort of asking the question, is he really the Messiah, or is he a political construct? Is their religion real, or is the whole thing the cynical construct of the Bene Gesserit? And meanwhile, we've got the Harkonnens doing really bad things to everybody. So if it feels like there's a lot going on in this movie,
that's all we have time for, actually.
yeah,
We're leaving
Come
now.
back next week for part 2. But actually, the first movie sets all of that up and stops. And I still remember sitting in the theater, I'm like, wait, come on, we haven't even started yet. The second movie moves faster and begins to really, set all these conflicts up, and then the action goes off.
Yeah,
very
spoiler
actionly.
warning. Spoiler warning. At the end of the first movie, Harkonnens win.
Right.
Kills most of the House Atreides.
And they think they got
Jessica
everybody.
escape into the desert, and then the story picks up from
They
there.
meet the Fremen.
Yeah, it's I think one of the most interesting points of this entire story arc is really that push-pull between how people see Paul and how Paul even sees himself.
Exactly.
You know, we talked about the Matrix a couple of episodes ago, and I think that there's a lot of similarities between Paul Atreides and Neo, because they're both presented as these messianic figures.
Yep.
They both have doubts about that. how do they deal with, I find that whole story arc very, very interesting.
Well, and the interesting thing is, Paul gradually becomes something terrible. And what I mean by that is, he is deeply fearful of becoming a messianic leader whom has been prophesied that millions will follow him, but that it will lead to basically, I don't know that they use the word jihad, but almost a holy war in which millions will die. And it's that tension between his free will and the fact that if he doesn't choose that, there are equally bad consequences. So in some ways, there's no way out. And I said that they're mostly good guys because as the story moves forward into Children of Dune and Dune Messiah, Paul is the good guy, becomes Paul the conflicted guy, becomes Paul. We're not sure that he hasn't become the bad guy in the process of saving everybody. Herbert is really playing with the complexities of a Messiah complex, a real Messiah. I don't think it's a flattering picture of religion really at all. Whether we're talking about the Bene Gesserit, who are these cynical, witch-like controlling figures, or the Fremen, who many of them are true believers, but you get, this sort of warrior class that they just want to kill everybody on behalf of Paul Atreides. And you sort of walk out like, I'm not sure I like either one of these in terms of if we're going to talk about a spiritual system of thought.
Well, it is very interesting, and I think that when you're talking about sort of that suspicion of religion, especially organized religion, I think that that's fair. But it is sort of interesting because it leaves the door open that maybe this guy really is the messianic figure that he's painted as being, and so there's this tension within the story, within the reader, within the viewer, as to what is really going on here. Is this just political operatives creating this Messiah? Or is there something really going on here?
Or is it both?
Or is it both? And that is really fascinating to me.
And part of the reason the story works really well.
I think so, because you need to have sort of that tension. And again, it sort of goes back to that whole idea that we found in The Matrix, right? One of the interesting visual cues that you get to this weird relationship, and maybe a hint that there's something more going on here. Arrakis has 2 moons that orbit it. And the big moon is called the Hand of God by the Fremen. The little moon is Muad'dib.
Right, the mouse.
The mouse, which is the name that essentially Paul takes on for himself.
Yes.
He's known by the Fremen as the Muad'dib.
How do you call the small desert mouse again?
Muad'dib.
Muad'dib.
No. Shh. Muad'dib is wise in the ways of the desert. Muad'dib creates his own water. The constellation that points to the North Star we call Muad'dib, the one who points the way. That is a powerful name.
And so you have this small moon with the hand of God there. And I find that a very interesting visual, if nothing else.
Well, and I think even backing away from the spiritual questions for a moment, this is a story about war and about revolution. I mean, it's really a war movie. It's a sci-fi war movie, but it's a war movie.
Oh, man, yeah.
And you've got generals, you've got all of this. And we haven't even talked about half the characters in the movie because there's so many of them.
So many.
But you also see the complexity of leadership. How on earth do you lead when you have these people who have these expectations of you? And you see it before Leto is killed, and he knows that he's walking into a trap.
We've been set up to fail.
Right? And yet he has no choice. So there is this very deep medieval kind of feel to the whole thing.
Yeah.
In the midst of it being a sci-fi movie.
Yeah, and
we haven't even talked about the worms yet.
I know, and I want to get to the worms, but I did want to mention that medieval vibe, because I think that's one thing that the 2 movies do really well.
Yeah.
Is the costuming that they have. They evoke this sense of I don't even know how they managed to do this, but it feels very medieval.
Yeah.
And it feels very sci-fi all at the same time. When you look at the outfits of the Bene Gesserit, they sort of remind me a little bit of those plague doctors, you know, with because they just have this aura about them, which is just fascinating. You have these one-on-one battles that you see between people that sort of harken back to the idea of these medieval.
Oh, well played, my friend. Harken.
Medieval and ancient duels. So it sort of feels like it's building on history even as it's writing its own, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and the bad guys.
Oh,
my goodness.
they are so bad.
It is so.
There is not a lot of nuance in the Harkonnens. Not a lot of nuance.
No, and the guy who played Elvis in that Elvis movie plays one of the really bad guys. Is he evil?
Man,
evil, one might say.
Evil. So I did want to get back to Baron Harkonnen. Again, it's sort of a visual that I noticed, especially in the first one. He does float around because he's just so fat, and the technology allows him to do that. But what they do in the movie, they give him this long robe, and so when he rises up, it looks like he's a snake almost, which I think is really effective, sort of getting into that whole very evil vibe.
Yeah, and I'm not a photographer or a videographer or a cinematographer or any kind of ographer, really.
A reviewer-ographer.
These are beautiful films. Now, there's a lot of violence. Read our full review at pluggedin.com and make sure you understand what you're getting into. But there are scenes that will take your breath away. And you get the sense that Denis Villeneuve, it really was a passion project for him to get those visuals right, and so much more than the ill-fated 1984 version or the miniseries. I'm like, man, this guy nailed it visually, and the performances, it's a tour de force story.
It really is. It really is. Now, that said, I did find when I rewatched the first one, I found it a little bit slower. This feels like, as could probably be said for The Dark Knight, as could be said for some of the other movies that we have talked about and will talk about.
Like Remains of the Day.
Exactly.
That's a slow movie. Holy cow.
Well, but when you're talking about those visuals and you're seeing it on the big screen, you become much more forgiving because the images are just so spectacular.
Yeah.
There is a scene at the end of Dune 2. I found the most compelling thing that I've seen in a theater since Lord of the Rings, honestly.
Yeah, I felt the same way. I felt like this was Dune 2, Part 2, was one of the best movies I've seen this millennium.
At least visually.
Yeah.
Right? It was just incredible.
You know what else? Bagpipes.
Bagpipes.
Oh,
what
the
were all the
bagpipes
bagpipes doing there?
We don't see the bagpipes, but we hear them, and they are amazing.
You actually do see them in Part 1.
Do we?
Yeah, there's a bagpiper
My bad, we
walking
do see
around.
them.
I don't know why there would be so many bagpipes. I found that strange.
But when all the armies are marching and the bagpipe music is playing, I mean, it sort of lends to that vaguely European medieval kind of feel to it.
But
I digress at this point.
Would you play bagpipes if you could?
Well, I do have a lot of hot air, so it seems like it could be the perfect instrument for me.
There you go.
I mean, you can save your hot air. What a beautiful idea.
But you do have, so we're getting back to this story a little bit. You know, you do have.
You're implying that we were off the map there, Paul, but I see what you did there.
I don't know. But it is really interesting to see these. One of the things that I really appreciated about both movies is that even though it treats religion very cynically, it shows the power of religion. It shows the power of faith. You know, you have these followers of Paul who are all in, and because they are all in, it makes them powerful and beautiful and dangerous all at the same time.
You know what else is dangerous?
The sandworms. So
do you want to talk about the sandworms, or would you like me to?
I think I would like you to talk, but I do want to bring them up. So I'll just give some background for the sandworms.
He's going to straight up talk about it.
I'm
He
gonna
said I
straight up
could
talk
do it,
about-
and now he's going to do
you're
it.
You're gonna do the heavy
No,
lifting.
it's
but-
fine. Just talk about
so
the
the
worms.
sandworms, they're these. So essentially, Dune
They're
has
worms
a
in the
lot
sand.
of sand, and underneath the sand there are these worms, and they are very, very big worms. Like they're supposed to be like 400 meters long. Some of them, you see
And
them
that's a little one.
swallowing things. One of the coolest
Bad
things-
guys often. It's awesome.
The only reason I didn't let you talk is because I wanted to mention this one image that I saw in the first movie.
Paul thinks he can stop me from talking. It's so funny.
What am I
What's the
thinking?
image?
So when Paul's sort of in one of his rooms in the palace on Arrakis,
Yeah.
they have this sandworm, right? And out of his mouth, their mouths are full of like this baleen stuff, like these wiry things, and
Their teeth.
teeth, exactly. But in this one, in sort of the brass thing that's behind him, it's a sun. And that shows, I think, the power of the sandworms to the Fremen people and the importance of these sandworms on Arrakis. And I know that the sandworms have a lot to do with the story besides being really terrifying.
It's true. So the sandworms are the creatures that create spice. And it's not even completely clear that anybody but the natives of the planet really understand that. So they're integral to the entire ecology. And honestly, as the story progresses, because I've read all the books, it's about ecology too. Now, you're
yeah.
not really looking at your watch while I'm talking.
I want to be
We're not in
mindful of
your
time.
cubicle. Paul does this when we're working. I'll be just talking about something, and he just looks at his
no.
watch, and I'm like, whatever.
This feels like too much information. Go ahead.
So the Fremen actually call them makers because that they understand that they are the source of spice. So the worms are interesting. The worms play important strategic roles in multiple battles. And we have a lot of
And
battles.
they look so cool. in
And
the
they're so
movies.
cool.
So cool.
So, sort of briefly putting our plugged in hat on, this is another movie with a lot of violence. And there are some scenes that are pretty dark. I mean, there are some people that Baron Harkonnen executes, and it's like, oof, he's a tough dude.
Yeah.
And there are some moments that, make you suck your breath in a little bit because you realize how bad this guy is.
Well, not only when you're talking about the Harkonnens, who are really, really terrible. I mean, they are as sadistic as you can possibly get,
Yep.
right? But even the planet itself. I
Yeah.
mean,
It's brutal.
make it clear that this is a very harsh landscape.
Yep.
And it is literally every day is a fight to survive. And you see that fight every moment. In some ways, when you look at the art that we've seen so far in the Dune movies, and I know that it goes on for how many books? 100, 200? A lot of books.
It's a lot. It gets pretty whack.
It does get pretty whack.
I think I checked out in the fifth one. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to tap out now.
Yeah, it gets pretty insane. But when we look at just the movies themselves, again, you see what we've been talking about in some of these movies, where good really seems to be under assault, and you
Yeah.
sort of wonder how good can win out.
Yeah.
Because we really do end the first movie, with the good guys being completely wiped out, essentially.
Right.
And Paul stranded in the desert with his mom. They're not very happy.
Right. And for Paul to have sort of a happy ending,
It
he
seems
has to become a
outlandish.
Messiah who knows that he's about to unleash a holy war that's going to kill millions of people. And he's legitimately conflicted about it. And he really gets sucked into the teeth of everything that's happening.
As it were.
As it
Just-
were.
Yeah.
And he really doesn't have much of a choice, even though he wants to make that choice.
It's interesting when we look at that point, because I think we could make the case for a lot of the movies that I think you and I both love.
Yep.
I really like my happy endings.
Right.
But when we think about the powerful movies that we have seen, oftentimes the endings are more complex.
Yeah.
There's more nuance to them. And we are left not with a happy feeling when we walk out of the theater, but sort of, okay, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of these things that Dune does really effectively. It
Yeah.
makes you think about what does that mean? Makes you think about your own world within the context of this sci-fi world that we're introduced to.
Well, and not to just go in a totally bizarre direction, but I'm going to go there. I wonder, because we do want black and white, we want good guys and bad guys, we want the happy endings, and yet we live in a world that's full of complexity and warfare and conflict and retribution. And so I think Herbert does a pretty good job of reflecting the reality of that world. And that even the good guys en route to trying to get to a good outcome sometimes do horrible things.
Yeah.
Like there's a, I think it's a Russian word, realpolitik, right? That, yeah, this is not a classic good guys win, bad guys lose. This is, man, there's horrible conflict in the world.
Yeah.
There are principled people, but even as they stand up against it,
Yeah.
it comes at tremendous cost to them.
Well, and it's interesting that you land there with that point, because it brings us back to the very beginning of this conversation. Frank Herbert, Tolkien.
Yeah.
Because when you think about the Lord of the Rings saga, that has a much more pure
It's much more
outlook,
black and white.
right? It is much more black and white. And yet, when we talk about the cost, Tolkien emphasized the cost.
Yep.
When you try to save the world, there's a cost involved. And that's a powerful message. That's not a very comfortable message
No.
for us, especially, I would say, those of us in America who are used to getting pretty much what we want all the time. you
Well,
know?
and in a way, it reminds me, and now I'm going to go in a totally different direction. It reminds me a little bit of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you know, who said,
Yeah.
when God calls us to follow, he bids us to come and die. I'm paraphrasing. That's not word for word. But that when we talk about our own faith, we are called to lay down our lives as we follow Christ for the sake of others. And so this is not a movie about Jesus in any way,
No.
shape, or form. But I do think one of the things that we try to do in our conversations here and at Plugged In is to look for those connecting points between the big themes, between the stories that are being told and our faith.
Yeah,
So I think there are
absolutely.
some here.
Absolutely, and I think that that's a great place to come in for a landing here. And we would love for you to join in the conversation. Comment down below, subscribe, like, ring that bell, do all those cool things that you do on YouTube. And remember that these stories are powerful. These are important things, and to not only watch, but to consider what they tell you.
Yeah. And talk.
And talk. Talk with people around you. I mean, if you go see Dune Part 2 again, take your family, take your friends and talk about it, because there's a lot to talk about. Just don't let it sit with you. Thanks so much. Really appreciate you being here.
We'll do it again soon.
Do
Yeah, I
you
think
wanna-
if you go in laughing until you cry, that's a great way to start. Are you trying to wipe the blue out of your eyes, Paul?
I'm losing bodily fluids. Okay.